Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Changing the Climate, a show where we talk about the changing world around us and how we can make it better. Brought to you by Climate Change Realty. The only real estate brokerage that donates 50% of its net commissions to 501c3 nonprofit organizations dedicated to fighting climate change. Cara, Judea, how are you?
Wonderful, Ethan. It's great to see you in person.
Yeah,
Virtually
see
in
us.
person. Our
Whatever
layers
this,
of contradiction. Yeah.
whatever we want to call this, I'm sure I'll contradict myself at least once throughout this podcast. But yeah, I'm really proud to introduce Cara, Judea, Alhadeff, and of course, we always love to get the show started with a little bit of background on who you are and how you got to be doing what you're doing at the moment.
All right, I'll jump in. So about half an hour ago, actually, really is a great representation of why I am here today, which is I was in another Jewish environmentalist organization Zoom meeting called Green Sabbath, and after the speakers gave their presentation, it was opened up for Q&A, as these things do, and the organizer said, "Oh, yes, here's Cara." She's because I was raising my hand, and so that reminded me of a different meeting I had a couple of days ago with it's a Jews of Color organization, and they were working with two Latinas who run something called Truth at Work. And a lot of our conversation was about speaking out and the costs of speaking out, and how we are compelled in our positions of marginality and in our positions also of hybridity to be that voice of whoa. It's just
voice of whoa.
Voice of hello. Life is always in motion, which is why I named my son Zazu, and that's a whole other conversation. But
get into it.
Yeah. So the absolute necessity, the imperative of speaking out against injustices, against and for justices. I'll put it in a positive framework. And so what just happened a half an hour ago reminded me of a major part of my history, which is that of speaking out, and speaking out in a way that is very much a part of my ethnic identity, my sexual identity, my political positions, how I live my life personally and politically. And also reminded me when I was defending my thesis as an undergrad, the director of the scholars program said to me, "If we tied your hands behind your back, you wouldn't be able to defend your thesis. You wouldn't be able to have a conversation." And it was so racist. It was so anti-Semitic. And it was just such a given, that's how people speak to people who are not part of that particular norm. So in reference to your question, what is my background? My background is this. My background is one of not letting things go.
Right.
Is like of accountability, both personal accountability, working towards corporate accountability, and certainly community responsibility, and accountability, like in situations that I may bring up in various eco-villages where I've lived. And a lot of this began because of my position. I was born in Boulder, as I shared with you earlier, and later moved as a child in between returning to Boulder to a small town in Texas. And as a Jew, and my mom was from New York, so
of course she was.
She's Sephardic. What'd you say?
I said, of course she was.
Of course, yeah.
We're all from New York or California.
Right, or San Francisco. I lived in San Francisco for 15 years, but we experienced such hostility and also violence, physical violence for me as a child there. But it really informed, like the worst time was really around fourth grade when I was 9, and it really informed how it is that I operate in the world, both as a kid then and as an adult now, in terms of understanding the connections between people who are disempowered and our sense of separation from one another in relation to this illusion of separation from our natural worlds. And it's highlighted again and again and again this morning with these co-Jewish environmentalists. There's still this, because I often bring to the forefront, wait a minute, when we're talking about alternatives to fossil fuel economies, and this was in the context of Shemitah and the Sabbath, and Shemitah is the 7-year cycles in Jewish philosophies, history, and Judaism, to let the land lay fallow. But it's used in the context of hyper-industrial economic growth. So it's being used in all of these modern capitalist ideas. How do we address convenience culture? People are saying renewables, well, actually renewables are rooted in fossil fuel economy, and we need to question that. So the whole idea of questioning, bottom line, is who I am.
It's a Jewish thing as well.
And that's a Jewish thing, right?
I would say as well.
And a multicultural, not just like one form of Judaism, but a multicultural element of Judaism.
So when you, in one of your talks, you mentioned how you said your life way, passions, and desires were on the margins of margins, and you just mentioned your position of marginality. Is that referring to like your Jewish background of being like 0.01% of the population, or is there something else that makes you like margin being like very small percentage, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So Jewish, but also a minority within a minority. I'm Sephardic, so I'm Spanish Jewish, and I also identify as Arab Jewish.
Can you explain the difference? So it was Sephardic and
sure,
what? Yeah.
So Ashkenazi,
yeah.
Most people in the U.S. associate Jews with Yiddish, with Jewish humor, with bagels, with gefilte fish, with New York.
That's me.
With a certain right, Shapiro, definitely, with Jews who come from an Eastern European background, and so that's the dominant, often white Jewish culture of being Jewish. My culture is actually obviously very similar, but very, very different in many ways. So my family, who was expelled from Spain, in alignment with the Mizrahi Jews, the Middle Eastern Jews. So we have a lot of cultural alignments and reverberation with Muslims. Often I find more with Muslims than with Ashkenazic Jews because of
reverberation. Did you say?
Oh, reverberations, like
tension.
Frequencies. A lot of
similarities.
Yeah. When you reverberate, you're alive together. That's what I mean.
Gotcha.
So those margins, being assumed that I'm white in certain environments, particularly like in eco villages, but then being for example, in Texas, I absolutely was not seen as white. So there's all of these racial and cultural / religious categories that I feel very much marginalized by and with. And then also politically, among progressives, among liberals, and even among some radicals, because of the way I choose to both raise my son and live my life. What I referred to, I think that you're taking from the living on the margins of the margins, is in relation to eco villages, where I've been living in various eco villages since I left home when I was 17, 18, in Europe and North Africa, and here in the US, with some normalcy environments in between. But in many of those situations, the commitment to ecological living, the commitment to racial equity, social justice, was not as, I'll say, integrated as I
Integrated
would
into
have
what?
liked.
Into the
Inter
eco village lifestyle,
Integrated
or
into people's lives. Yeah, like just the
in the
fundamentals.
country or the whole world, or what are you talking about in particular?
So in the particular eco villages, for example, I
Okay.
lived in one eco village, Ithaca, for
So
example.
let's talk about what is an eco village, because I've never heard of it, and I imagine most
Oh,
people
okay,
haven't as well. Yeah.
got it. Right. No, so an eco village is an intentional community. So a group of people, mostly in this country, white, quote unquote, educated, college educated, people. Often, I've been making the distinction a lot with my partner around dropouts versus people who want to drop in, like deeply drop in. But people who want to create an alternative to status quo capitalist, living in your individual home with your separate lawnmower and your separate blender, and
Hmm.
people who are really ideally often looking for a way to live in deeper alignment with their natural world, with the world around
Hmm.
them. So in some cases, but very infrequently, there's shared transportation. So that's often been a challenge. I've never owned a car for political reasons, and
Ever?
I've never owned a car. No,
Wow.
no. And I use that as an educational model. Like I'm 50 years old. I've
It can be
lived.
done.
Say again.
So
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
50,
and
it could
I've
be
lived.
done, and you're happy.
Yes, and I'm happy. I'm healthy. Knock on wood, mashallah. So that allows me and my son to walk and to bike everywhere, and we've lived in environments where that was possible. Um, and I and it's not about economic, abundance necessarily, because I've
Hmm.
lived far below the poverty line, because I focus on a barter economy primarily in how I live. Um, so a lot of my choices are about um, re-examining what we think is necessary and are taken for granted world of, oh, that's necessary, that car is necessary, that credit card, that smartphone is necessary. And I've never owned, you know, any of those things
Whoa.
explicitly as a like political agenda, as an educational agenda.
I'm really intrigued how you got to this point. And you said you've lived well below the poverty line, meaning that you haven't spent much money, but you've had like everything you need. Are you living in some kind of like communal environment where people are sharing things, like a kibbutz kind of thing? Is that what the eco
Um,
villages are like? Or
right, yeah. So kibbutz is a model of that. The eco villages often, and I'll answer your question directly, but I'm still
and I want to talk
answering
about the
the
barter economy that you mentioned, like not using money to get things.
yes. Well, so I guess there's three things that we're talking about right now. So the eco village is, um, again, an alternative to status quo middle class suburbia, let's say. Often, though, it ends up mimicking that world because those values are so entrenched in us as US citizens,
Hmm.
in terms of that really is an attempt to develop a sense of community and intimacy that doesn't require this outside currency, but more our what we have to offer in terms of our skills, individual skills. And now I'm not living in an eco village. My partner and son and dog and I, we live in our converted school bus. It's a repurposed school bus. Um, Love bus family. I hate to say it on Facebook. So lots of contradictions there. Ah!
We all live with them.
Say again.
We all have them. We all live with
We
them.
are,
It's fine.
yes, yeah, we are human, and my first book is actually very much all about those contradictions and ambiguities and how can we thrive in those in between spaces.
Hmm.
And I can share more about that one later.
Definitely.
But so we're not living in an explicit intentional community now, but we are for the first time we're in Paonia, Colorado, and for the first time we really feel a sense of tremendous alignment with the people around us, and it's more of a community than really maybe anywhere that I've lived, except for perhaps San Francisco in the 90s, in terms of the art scene and the queer community. That was strong there.
Okay.
But none of the eco villages, there's always been such a sense of again of property. Like this is still my privatized space and my privatized ideology, and you're not going to transgress it. And this is not about coevolution, but me proving my point. So
I'm
that's
I, I'm extremely curious what your educational path was to get you to where you are today. Did you go through like the traditional elementary school, high school, college, PhD route that like all the rest of Americans are doing, or did you do something unique? Did you go travel the world in between? I'm really curious how you got to be the way you are today.
well, I think a lot of it, my extraordinary parents, who were divorced when I was 6, and that divorce actually led to me experiencing vast cultural differences.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a part of it. In terms of institutional education, I did go through the public school and then high school, and I took off time after high school, and I think
Smart.
that should just be required. Yeah. And
Mm.
I lived in intentional communities, in communes in Europe and North Africa. And that time was the most opening in terms of really understanding how our complexities are both, can be both devastating in terms of human nature, and just, that's what makes us extraordinary beings. And that was all when I was 18. And when I came back, I remember I met with some of my friends who I've known, my 3 of my oldest friends who I've known for 47 years at this point,
Mm-hmm.
um, and between 44 and 47 years. And they had just come back from their colleges,
First year.
they were all, yeah. And I just remember thinking, I was in such culture shock, and I couldn't even use a water fountain because it was just this taken for granted normal thing that you go over, you press this button and water comes out.
Mm-hmm.
And there was, and the whole idea of small chat, all of it was, or small talk, all of it was, it just felt very anti-life to
Wow.
me. But then I did go to Sarah Lawrence College
Mm-hmm.
in New York for a couple of years, and then
New York
my
City.
mom, no, Westchester. They called it Westchester when they were trying to
Westchester.
recruit students, and they called it Yonkers when they were trying to get funding,
Okay.
because of the economic
Yeah.
differences. Um, and then my mom was teaching in the visual arts department at Penn State and was diagnosed with a form of leukemia in the early 90s. And I left Sarah Lawrence to go be with her and ended up going to Penn State. And that was just the most really phenomenal educational opportunity in
Mm-hmm.
terms of access to a world that I could make myself, because they did have funding. So I made my own major corporeal politics. And that's what I was referring to in the very beginning when the director um, constrained my psyche and body. um, and then years later, I ended up, maybe 10 years later, I went through a PhD program with the European Graduate School.
Do you
And
have
I
EU
think,
citizenship as well?
no, but as a Sephardic Jew, I could get Spanish citizenship and Portuguese.
Huh.
And then there's a lot of other politics around tokenism with the Spanish government and their virulent anti-Semitism that, again, another discussion.
Yeah, we have a lot of that in the world. It's just part of the game. But all right, so I want to get into some content here. So we've talked a lot about the issue of climate change on this show and some solutions and just general environmental degradation. We've spoken about minimalism at length. So I want to ask you about feminist embodied theory, but I think before that I wanted to see what issues you have with the current sustainability movement, because last week we spoke about how I'm very much in favor of regeneration. I think you can speak on that very well as well. So what's wrong with just even just the verbiage of sustainability in your mind?
Right. So my first book, if I may do a little plug.
Please do. Yeah, go right ahead.
So Viscous Expectations, Justice, Vulnerability, the Obscene, very much looks at sustainability in relation to sustaining growth, sustaining economic progress. This book particularly is looking at the vulnerability of the body as a strategy for social justice to counter these ideas of sustainability that are actually fulfilling a sense of normalcy, fulfilling the status quo, fulfilling mainstream consumerism, mainstream sense of entitlement, ownership, property. What I'm seeing with renewables, what I was speaking about before, is very much perpetuating this idea of sustainability that
Got to keep growing, got to keep moving, got to keep the
right.
train rolling.
And
It's America. We got to get bigger.
yeah, and even in the face of people driving their Priuses and sending their kids to nature preschool and doing all the supposed right things with the illusions like recycling, that massive illusion, compostables, BPA replacements, LEDs, all of the these everyday supposed alternatives that are actually simply reinforcing industrial capitalism.
Wait. What's wrong with compostables? Doesn't that just turn into dirt?
Compostables, no. So compostables, bioplastics, just so we're speaking about the same thing. Is that what you're
I don't know.
asking?
I get a banana peel and throw it away. But yeah, you're talking like the compostable cups is like that bioplastic
Yes,
bit, right?
yes. Like I've been to dozens and dozens of conferences, where environmental conferences or eco justice conferences even, where they are in their little refreshments. Thank God they're not petroleum plastic water bottles. Those are also often at environmental conferences, which blows me away, or even human rights conferences. But the supposedly compostable cups or silverware, and those are bioplastics that are often grown with monocrop corn, hosted by Monsanto, glyphosate, Roundup, and they can only be composted in a certain temperature, and it takes so there's all kinds of chemistry that doesn't allow for an everyday household, for example, to have those disintegrate, but it gives people the impression that they're doing something beneficial, and so they have permission to buy. And not only that, but they have permission to buy more and more, and they feel like that they can then waste. And the whole idea of waste, of course, needs to be completely unpacked. That's what my second book, Zazu Dreams, addresses in many ways, the idea of waste and how people are seen as waste, and how we need to look at those relationships between people seen as waste and objects that we think are going to be thrown away. And this whole idea of away, of course, is also a falsehood.
Correct.
And then how do we begin to look at cross-cultural models for a shift away from this sustainability, the sustainability of normalcy?
Dig into that a little bit? Cross-cultural models, are you referring to like indigenous knowledge kind of thing, or what does that mean?
Yeah, both. So indigenous, often when the idea of indigeneity refers to native peoples from these continents from North and South, global North and South, and Americas. And in Zazu Dreams, Between the Scarab and the Dung Beetle, a cautionary fable for the Anthropocene era. In that cross-cultural climate book, I'm looking at indigenous relationships to agriculture, engineering, architecture, not just from native peoples from these lands, but specifically Middle Eastern indigenous peoples.
Mm-hmm.
And also the characters visit Southern India. So looking at models that have existed for thousands of years, also in terms of healing and medical models that don't involve big pharma. So really questioning our relationship to big pharma, big ag, big banks. There's a whole checking out our addiction to these conglomerates, and then looking at ways of understanding and modeling natural world examples of symbiosis, and then these cross-cultural examples of symbiosis.
So I guess my question would be, so there is like big number of people though. So how do we deal with like getting all these people what they need without these big large conglomerates having so much control and obviously misusing it at certain points? What is the alternative? Because didn't these indigenous communities live in like small tribal groups where they, and then I know one of the things from reading lots of Simon Sinek's work and hearing his take on anthropology is that human beings do very well in groups of 150, and once you get beyond that, things start to break down because you don't know everyone personally. So how can we create large scale systems that will actually work based on these models that, as far as I know, there hasn't been any other like governmental organizational body that has had the ability, I don't know the ability, or some people, you're obviously very critical of the US, as most people are in America, at least these days. But yeah, I just don't see like what like has worked better than what exists currently, even if what exists currently is still not working that well.
Well, two things. One is when we look at, for example, eco-villages or other intentional communities that range maybe from 70 to 200 people. That's the group, the
Sounds
number
about
that
right.
I've lived in.
Yeah.
Because we've so deeply internalized the values of capitalism, the values of industrialization, the illusion that civilization actually is a given, the way we live in the midst of its total barbarism. Even in those places, in that small group of people, because those values are so deeply internalized, there hasn't really been a profound alternative, because we're still replicating those norms. It's kind of like many of them are glorified suburbias. What I'm suggesting is a simultaneous individual, community, corporate, and policy examination. And it is simultaneous, which demands a lot from ourselves. It requires a tremendous slowing down and a process of questioning, as I mentioned before, what we do take for granted, so that our daily behavior is constantly reflected in these larger scopes. The micro is constantly reflected within the macro. And something I'm playing with now, an eco-social paradigm shift, which I'm calling SOUL, an acronym, which obviously has its problems too, but shared, opportunity, used, and local. And this isn't about some kind of hyper idealistic illusion, because when we see, even in larger towns, like there are two towns right now in Utah that have instituted growth moratoriums. There are cities, growth moratoriums, that's tremendous. I mean, there are examples when we focus on this intersection of individual, community, corporate, that's when the micro and the macro can begin to shift. And of course, it's unbelievably challenging and confusing and disorienting because we have so deeply internalized these other values as, oh, well, I need that, and my child needs that, and we need this to be healthy and stable. And when in fact, if we begin to see like the O in soul, shared opportunity, used local, the O is a invitation for people to take creative risks together. And for those risks to then translate into bigger pictures. But we have to start, I think it's been clear, we have to start in our personal lives in relation to. So it's not just blaming the individual and ignoring that infrastructures determine so much, but like in the Occupy movement, when we're blaming the 99%, or in so many environmentalist constructs, we're blaming oil, we're pointing our finger at oil and gas, yet we're completely participating in those oil and gas economies.
Definitely.
So it's the simultaneity that I think is absolutely crucial, and that requires, again, slowing down and collaborative creative risk taking.
All right. I love the way you think. It's so unique. I've never talked to anyone like you in my life. And in order to shine a light on your ideas more, I'm gonna push back, and I'm gonna ask,
yeah.
what evidence do you have that something like this that you're proposing could actually work? Like, what, any sort of historical evidence to
I know that I
show
have evidence, but
not all right, or pontification, whatever, like, of these things that I love the idea. I love the idea of like,
right.
a group is 150 and then we just keep stacking them and then they all work together. If like, cause like, I don't know. Hey, go ahead.
Well, for me, it's less a question of evidence and more of what has to be done. You know,
Well, yeah, fair enough.
This is like,
To avoid
of
collapse.
course, say again.
To avoid collapse.
Well, yeah, and not just to avoid something, but to build a sense of integrity in our lives. I mean, of course, me never owning a car really makes no difference, and I understand that, except I do believe that modeling is education, and that education, and I'm not talking obviously about formalized education, institutionalized education, I'm speaking about education in terms of our daily lives, how we're choosing to interact with one another, and how we're choosing to interact with objects around us and with histories around us. When I pick up this candle, where was it made? Is it petroleum based? When my son's school is looking to buy new clipboards, or for example, music stands, that's what they're doing now, rather than, and they can't afford just to buy new ones. So I'm suggesting, if they can't get donations, let's go to local welders. And town is filled with artisans and with people who do construction. Let's work with the community. And this is where the soul comes in and the opportunity. Let's work with local community members to build music stands. They may not look like formal music stands that we're used to seeing, but then we don't take these things for granted. And then we can learn, and the kids can learn, the children can learn that the metal was mined perhaps in a Bolivian tin mine, and that people's lives, so this is where environmental racism comes in. There are people's lives who are involved in, like, the microphone, right? I mean, how many, we take the embodied energy, the ridiculousness, we're both on these computers, these laptops. I do own a laptop, right? I mean, it's obvious. But in how I educate my son, it's implicit that he understands what happens with e-waste, with electronic waste, that all of these elements are integral. And just one more thing before you jump into your next question. A lot of what I share and write about and teach, hopefully in a way that is an invitation and not seen as a judgment, is petroleum parenting. This idea of how as parents can we look at the ways that we're contributing to environmental devastation and humanitarian abuses and make other collective choices through our relationships to consumerism, through our relationships to corporate accountability, and not just blaming the corporations and blaming fossil fuel investments, but really looking at ourselves, again, the simultaneous, the mirror, the echo.
Yeah. Well, I love that idea that things don't just appear. Like when you like go and buy something at the store, it's not just like, oh, it was at the store. Like someone had to create it and craft it.
Yeah.
And what I will say is I do disagree with you when you said that you not having a car doesn't make any difference, because now you're on this show and you've written 4 or 5 books, or you've done a bunch of talks, and I'm sure you've probably mentioned in other talks. And when you say that to people and you look very healthy and happy and normal, people be like, huh, like I can do that too. Oh, I forget what else.
I can clarify. I absolutely believe it makes a difference, which is why
You
I
do it.
do it, and which is why with my son, if we have to walk or bike or hitchhike, we've made so many amazing relationships because we've gotten rides from people, and that's not about usurping someone else's choice to own a car. It's about relationship and shared, that goes back to the soul, shared quote unquote resources. And we can talk about the whole idea of a resource being, colonialist and imperialist to begin with.
I want to talk about that next.
But so absolutely, it makes, I think I feel, I breathe that it makes a difference. And it's just one of many departure points from many extending relationships. So that's what I want to say, that it's not an end all by any means, but it's about these interrelationships and constantly acknowledging how our behavior is reflected in others' behavior, and how that is reflected in much grander when we're talking about big ag, for example.
Right. Well, people are like terrified of other people. They've been wronged so many times. You telling someone that
Yes.
they should go hitchhike, they would never do something like that. How can someone get over that when they watch horror movies where people get killed all the time and stuff? And we live, and one thing I noticed when I lived in Australia, even like a country that's part of like the British Commonwealth, that's so similar to our own country, I would walk around with headphones in because I'm American and this is just what we do. We go to class, we walk, and I would walk by myself and I would look around and like everyone's like in pairs, like hanging out with other people. And I'm like, huh, like I'm the only one who's like alone. Cause like in America, you got to do your own thing and figure it out yourself. You got to be independent. I mean, that's so deeply ingrained in our culture. Just an anecdote from me, but I want to kind of get into your criticisms of like capitalism and green capitalism and how it relates to colonialism. This is something we've never talked about on this podcast before, and kind of get into the criticisms of like how our society functions on like a macro level, I guess.
Well, so let me drop into the micro for a moment in terms
You
of what
got
you were
it.
just talking about with self-reliance.
Mm-hmm.
When I was pregnant with my son 10 years ago, I don't know how many events and books out and articles about the cry it out method and teaching your infant to sleep alone. And I've written a lot about what this means in terms of our privatized world. How then, like even in the eco villages where people are where there is no shared transportation, where eating together is maybe a once a week activity, and that means that we would be using less. If you're using propane, for example, to cook your food, we would be using less propane because we would be cooking together. But these layers are there's so many elements that feed into this illusion of self-reliance and this illusion of mine and my space, my property, my ownership. One phenomenal aspect of the Jewish concept of Shemitah that I mentioned earlier, of letting go, this 7-year sabbatical of letting the land lay fallow, is to take down the fences, take down the gates, where property is not about us versus them any longer. Xenophobia exclusionism, and obviously racism, eugenics. I mean, all of that feeds into and stems out of the idea of private property. So in this sabbatical year, there's this idea, and I mean, how radical, right? How absolutely incredible would it be if it wasn't just, this is my space and you can't enter it. Where we still have integrity and boundaries, of course, but where there's a whole different understanding of our interdependency. And if we could unlearn as adults and teach our children, co-learn, co-teach with our children, a whole different understanding of us versus them, of divide and conquer, where people with different opinions, different backgrounds, different orientations to, you know, how they conduct themselves physically, their politics, all of that, if that was an invitation for dialogue rather than an invitation for battle. Shalom, peace, is not about the absence of war, but it's about negotiation. It's about difference, you know? And for me, not owning a car or a credit card or smartphone is not about saying I'm doing something right and you're doing something wrong. It's about inviting in dialogue, inviting in a difference, because I don't obviously expect people to leave suburbia or their urban areas or wherever they're living and to move into a converted school bus and to repurpose everything, you know, from their DC refrigerator that used solar panels, or that's not what I'm suggesting at all. What I'm suggesting is moving beyond what we think is absolute. Like you said, give me some evidence. Instead, playing with the possibilities, reimagining, re-envisioning a future and present simultaneous by looking at our past, other cultures' pasts, our own pasts. If we dig into our own ancestral lineages and memories, I'm sure each of us have so much to learn and to contribute. So again, it's the simultaneous acknowledgement of past, present, future, individual, community, corporation, policy, to self-reflect, to be vulnerable, to ask questions, to collaborate. And it's not about knowing the answers, obviously. It's about, you know, being raw and saying, this isn't working. We've got to make some major changes, and not within the framework, the sustainability framework, the renewables framework, which imply economic growth, efficiency, the whole idea of efficiency, recycling. You know, you're doing it in order to do more. And what if doing more, I'll say one last thing. What if doing more meant being alive more? And that's not about sacrifice. You know, people often say self-restraint is sacrifice. You know, that's not sexy. Who wants to sacrifice? You know, we like our comforts. What if it was about reframing and creating infrastructures that supported us, so we didn't have to have comforts that relied on other people's hell?
You're talking about us keeping all the resources and then disenfranchised places being destroyed. All right, here's what's happening. I'm throwing out the questions. I want to explain where I'm at and see what you have to say, and see if we can kind of come to some solutions here, some like practical actions that you and I or anyone who's listening can actually take to get this world to I love the idea of us collaborating, communicating, and throwing away things that are obviously inequitable and bad for most people, but maybe good for like a small percentage of the population. But so here's what I got. I went to business school. I studied business management, entrepreneurship. I've been raised to be an individualist and go out, forge my own path, create my own destiny. But I'm a very introspective person, and I also had a minor degree in philosophy. So I'm deeply infatuated with what is the best way to be living, what's the most virtuous life you can possibly live. So I've come from the framework of I'm going to plug into the capitalist system, and out of it I'm going to bring great good and value to the world. That's the way I see things. So now I'm doing this business climate change realty where I do, I'm right in the system, selling assets, creating wealth for people. And what I'm doing is I'm taking all of my wealth and I'm trying to give it to people who are going to do better work than me, who can come up with the creative solutions that will fix the system, because I don't have the mind to go and reform the system, which is why I'm talking to intelligent people like you who can think about all the way the world works. And I want to give people like you, or people who run nonprofit organizations, or people who are willing to recreate or not even recreate, just build off of the system that we have and make it better. So I believe that by using the system we have in place, we can create better corporations that give back to the planet. So that's where I'm at. What do you think we can do with this? From what I've understand, that the world is the best it's ever been. As much as we're like destroying the planet and killing all the resources for people, there's less people impoverished than has ever been in the past, as far as like a percentage wise. If like 500 years ago 60% of people were like living under the poverty line, now it's like 20% or something. So it's been an improvement. That's what I understand. Maybe I'm wrong, correct me if I'm wrong. But so it seems things have gone up, but it also seems like a lot of the resources have gone to a very small percentage of the population, and they're hoarding it and then sucking them all up. So I would just like to figure out how to live in a way where everything is being enriched through our actions, where we're all working together with the plants, the animals, the humans are treating each other well. Doesn't mean we all have to have like an equal role and an equal outcome. I wouldn't propose that, because it's a fact that some people work harder than others and would like to have more rewards from that. But so yeah, that's where I'm at. I believe that the system in place can be fixed and made better, and create the systems that we're looking for through businesses and corporations. So I wanted to see what you say to that, because I can't ask questions. I just want to hear your thoughts.
Yes, and I certainly appreciate much of what you just said, and I very intensely disagree with much of what you just said, and that's great, right?
It wouldn't be fun if you didn't.
Just briefly, in terms of that things are better now and even defining poverty, when we look at the way all the isms have transformed, sexism, racism, homophobia, poverty, what we have done so meticulously is to create band-aids and facades and illusions to perpetuate the absolute vile nature of all those things, where they are festering and so much worse in so many ways, including our physical health. So just because, like this morning we were talking about, when my son was getting ready for school, my husband was sharing that his friend who used to work in a hospital showed a photograph of doctors who were smoking in the hospital, and it was an advertisement for, look, even doctors do it, it reduces stress. And so yes, we're not in that place, right, where doctors are advertising, but hospitals, the medical establishment, just as one example, has become such the big pharma has become such the emphasis on power and greed at the expense of our bodies, where children are our collateral damage again and again and again. That's one example. In terms of environmentalism, yes, certain rivers are not on fire, or lakes, are not on fire because Kodak is no longer dumping their photochemicals in the lake.
Mm-hmm.
But the pervasiveness of poisons, of toxins in every element of our lives, whether it's as subtle as a receipt that a woman who just bought BPA-free, baby containers, baby bottles for her baby that she's not able to breastfeed because she had physical complications because of the C-section, and is now using these BPA supposedly free, when the replacements of BPA are so much more toxic, and the receipt that she just touched to buy those things, and those things, by the way, right, are made in China, and who knows what living conditions and working conditions. And now she's she'll feed her baby something, or she'll touch something, or she'll touch her baby's face, and those chemicals in the receipt are so much worse than the original BPA product to begin with. So, I mean, that's two among
I acknowledge
so
both
many
of those.
examples. And again, the racism, I mean, the level of tokenism and sexism in any kind of paying job, whether you're doing quote unquote menial labor or, in certain. So again, these supposed advancements, improvements, I think again and again, we can show that things, I don't want to even say better or worse,
Mm-hmm.
but the levels of complications and the levels of manufactured consent have reached such subtleties and pervasiveness. They're so insidious that our responsibility, and when I say responsibility, I don't mean some kind of punishing, you're responsible for this, or individuals are responsible, or shaming, but the ability to respond, responsibility, our empathy, that must be developed in order for us to see how our lives and how our quote unquote comfort, our comforts are so reliant on other people's suffering, and on the natural, and on wildlife suffering, and on natural habitat suffering. So I really need to say that in terms of the idea of improvement and poverty, and that we need to start redefining poverty. Because when we're defining poverty in the context of wealth, for example, in 93-ish, 94, I was living in Bangladesh. I was doing food aid work in Bangladesh. And unfortunately, I was working for USIA. I didn't realize at the time that they're a branch of the CIA. And it's very much about promoting US democracy. And I realized that as I was there, because I was trying to get to the roots of why the droughts and the floods were creating such phenomenal havoc in these people's lives. But the people I was there working for, the food aid people, it was all about Band-Aids. And those Band-Aids are killing us, and they will continue to kill us unless we begin to recognize that there are superficial ways of maintaining status quo, the illusion that the standard of living is one of wealth, and actually not seeing that we ourselves are radically impoverished in the way many of us are living our lives with our
morally,
but logistically, commuting
spiritually,
you may, yes, spiritual across the board. You're getting in your BMW, you're driving, you're doing your commuter drive. Of course, it's a little different now with COVID, but not so different, being that we're on computers all the time. And Jeff Bezos is the world's first trillionaire. And this idea
is that new? Quarantine. Did that just happen?
No. What I'm saying is, in terms of Amazon sales, have gone, prime, unbelievable since COVID. So the illusion that this has been a consumption quarantine is also bogus. What I mean in terms of poverty, our impoverished lives, yes, morally, spiritually, structurally, in terms of spending time with our families, actually nourishing our bodies and our ecosystems through living in homes that aren't contaminated with buying a new couch, and that couch is off-gassing, and where where was that, where were those chemicals produced? Solar panels, buying, my family can afford new solar panels in our 7,000 square foot house, And where were those what are the what was the extractive mining involved? What are the minerals in the solar panels, let alone the infrastructure? And I just discuss all of this in my book Zazu Dreams. But when we unpack those ideas of I'm doing it because I'm trying to do the right thing, or because it's trendy, because it's socially responsible, like you're saying, socially responsible corporations. You know, the whole idea, what's the acronym? SRC.
You know, Caesar, yeah, Caesar, corporate social ethical responsibility, something like that.
Yeah. So all of that needs to be, I'm not saying it's a no or a yes. It's not a binary.
Life isn't a black and white, you know?
Right. And as Jews, we know that. But we have to tease out the relationships and what we think is a given. It requires tremendous self-inquiry and a willingness to put ourselves in a position of analysis, of being grilled, you know, but grilling ourselves in a way that's loving, though.
Absolutely.
Too. So I want to emphasize that also.
Well, some people,
is essential to this.
Yeah, no, you need to always be, I mean, that's, again, it's a Jewish thing, being criticized so you can become better. Or it's not even a Jewish thing, just it's a thing for growth. You're always looking for mentors to help you be better. And if we don't want to use the term better or worse, I would say all I was saying is that the current state of affairs is preferred to the past state. Everything you're saying is accurate. I'm aware of the dysfunction of our society, and that's why I'm working every day to try to play my part to make it more preferable. But what I'm saying is 100 years ago, a woman couldn't vote. 300 years ago, nobody could vote. And we lived under monarchical systems all the way back to maybe back 70,000 years ago. We lived in these communal environments where people had respect for each other. But as things scaled out and these empires took place, usually it was kings, lords, and peasants, and most people were peasants. And now we're getting to a point where, yes, there are still peasants. That's bad. We should treat everyone well. I personally believe in a minimum standard of living for all people. Regardless if that makes sense or not, I think that's a good idea, and we should treat people well. Go ahead.
Just in terms of minimum, again, this is not about where I'm coming from, and what I would like to teach is not about minimum. It's not about less, because that whole scale is based on productivity. It's based on a framework of accumulation and based on a framework of haves and have-nots. So the whole idea of minimum, I just want to check, and part of our conversation, it has to do with language, right? Our language itself is compounding the very systems of oppression.
Certainly.
And when we think that we're living less or we're living minimally, when in fact the extraordinary abundance of what it means to actually recognize our interconnectedness, that is so overflowing and so maximum, you know?
Yeah.
So I just want to highlight, because so much of the danger of these conversations is that people think, oh, she's suggesting we go back and live in a cave, you know, or a bus, you know, and this is.
I think you're suggesting something that's never really existed before, which is why I'm so interested in it.
Well, I think it exists in
nature.
Yeah, I mean, it exists among people and in nature and in history and in contemporary lives in a myriad ways. It's when we begin to make the connections, and then we can see, oh, that way of living and that way of living and that interrelationship and that interdependency, all of those put together can create a map, you know, can create a framework. for us. And I would say exactly the opposite. It's all here already. Stephen Hawking, and he's one of the characters in Sausage Dreams. Everything we need to know is already within us, just waiting to be realized. Yeah. And that's very much of an indigenous concept, major cross-cultural indigenous concept, that it's here. It's a question of being receptive, of slowing down enough, of not participating in the systems that we think are just a given, to witness what does already exist, and then we apply it. You know, that's where we use our human intelligence, or our you know, our capacity as whatever we are, as different from things that we have deemed as other. Mm-hmm. That's where we take our sense of responsibility and compassion, and again, risk, and say, this is, you know, the word radical means root. That's, you know, the Latin. And I think if we did that with a lot of our words, our language isn't inherently imperialistic. A lot of it, I think a lot of it can give us some amazing insight when we look at the various Latin and Greek derivatives. English is an oppressive language in many ways, but in many ways, the answers are even just in our language. Mm-hmm. You know, when we're looking at the roots of words. Oikos, O-I-K-O-S, is the root of eco. It's home. It means home, and that's ecology and economics. Economics and home in 2021, you know, very little intimacy between economics and home, except for, oh, you bought a new carpet, you know, or your new solar array. But how much of economics and ecology in the context of home could be re-envisioned together in small communities, and then have that become models for larger communities? We make up the macro. I mean, the micro makes up the macro.
Without a doubt.
So when we're going around chanting, I mean, my son was born a couple of months before the Occupy movement, and we were in Oakland, unassisted home birth on my 40th birthday, a couple blocks away from the Oakland Federal Building, where much of the Occupy movement took place. Literally tanks and SWAT teams were outside of our window. And when he was a few months old, we marched, and so much of the march was, you know, we're the 99%. So it's up to us to work together to cross over into the corporate. Not, I would say, just by making corporate responsible, but a complete shift in how we understand power relationships. And so much of it is about accountability, but so much of it is about vulnerability also.
Okay. So are you writing 2 books right now?
Well, yeah, several things are going on. I have about 6 anthologies coming out. I'd like to share, for your viewers, I'd like to share the one I mentioned before, Zazu Dreams, mm-hmm. Between the Scarab and the Dung Beetle, Cautionary Fable for the Anthropocene Era. I want to share that one in particular, more than the other books at the moment. And if people are interested, they can go to my website and to see all my writings, or many of them, carajudea.com. And I'll just say, because I'm adapting Zazu Dreams to a stage performance and a screen performance. And in my fantasy world, it would be something along the lines of Hamilton in terms of access, broad viewership. And I would love to do a musical version of this cross-cultural climate justice book. And also a screen production. So if people are interested in collaborating, I would love that. So that's the one I want to highlight out of all the other materials.
So, all right, let's talk about that, whatever you want to highlight about that book. But I really want to dig into more about the next project you're working on, which is how we actually would go about transforming Anthropocene
Yes,
into the Ecozoic era. Because
yes.
I'm looking for a solution. If if we can get to this idealized state that you're kind of talking about, I would want to think about how to practically accomplish that. And I, as a business person, can't think of any other way to do it but through markets. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. But do you want to talk about Zazu for a while
No,
first?
no, no. I'm happy to jump in. I'd say what I'd like to focus on at this moment is in terms of making real change, pervasive
Yes.
change.
Mm-hmm.
I,
Today, this year.
today, today, I'm going to say our kids in relation to us, how we're raising, how we are framing education. And this isn't just about people who have children by any means. It's, you hear all the time, oh, it's the children, the Greta Thunberg, and I'm not going to have birds in 20 years. I mean, all of this. What if we were teaching ourselves and our kids to have a different relationship to the objects around us, where we see a tree and we don't see a resource, we don't see something that is just going to benefit us, even shade, but where we see a tree and we understand a history, that the tree has its own history, and we understand that trees communicate among themselves, and that plants have decentralized nervous systems, and they are electrical beings. We are all electrical beings. And for that to become part of our educational model. So yes, markets, yeah, I mean, it's got to be multi-pronged. My emphasis is on how we look at our daily lives, and that will then influence the markets. We look, I can send you some of my articles about smartphones and how the market has been so saturated for adults. So now, where so many of these companies are literally saying it is time that children now are our prime market for smartphones.
Mm-hmm.
Even knowing how toxic they are to children's bodies, let alone their capacity for empathy, their ability to see when they're used before the age of 2. I mean, there's so many layers why it is extraordinarily obscene that smartphone manufacturers are targeting children as their primary audience now that the adult market has been saturated. So I think these multi-pronged approaches go hand in hand with one another. And if they don't, then we're in trouble. That education has to go hand in hand with marketing, with a
Cool.
constant checks and balances.
All right. Well, let's talk about Zazu before we go. Just like anything you want to explain about it. I would love to hear anything you have got to say. Here's what I'm thinking right now. I could sit here and talk to you for the next 3 hours. So because I can't do that, I hope you're willing to come back on the show at some point and talk
Sure.
again. Because we could go for so long, and I'm maybe one of these days I'll do one of those shows like that. So I mean, you would definitely be someone I could do that with. But yeah, let's talk about the book you want to promote. I'd love to hear all about it.
So Zazu Dreams, and I don't have a copy, but if you could include an image, that would be great. Thanks.
I'll put it as a thumbnail right here.
Okay. All right, great. I'll just, before I get into the book, just as some background, that often when people hear who's endorsed it, they pay more attention because they think it's a children's book, and it's not. It's a fable for adults. And it's been endorsed by Noam Chomsky, Bill McKibben, Paul Hawken, David Orr, James E. Hansen, who's the major climate scientist, Eve Ensler, who many of us know, Shakji Humpty Hump, who recently died. He's my son's uncle from Digital Underground. Stephanie Seneff, who's fought Monsanto for so many years. So a number of Paul Hawken, so a number of activists, artists, scholars, scientists, Arun Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi's grandson. And they've endorsed it, I'm going to say, from very different perspectives. Some looking at the humanitarian content, some looking at the environmental content, some looking at the necessity to create a new genre of education, like Arun Gandhi called it edutainment. It's divided into two sections. One is the image and the narrative, the first section, and then the second is about 400 endnotes of historical, literary, economic, environmental, science references. So it's a dialogue between the sciences and the humanities. And it's really about unlearning what we think we know and opening into the capacity of children's empathy and our own sense of empathy by seeing the connections between humanitarian abuses and ecological collapse, but then looking at cross-cultural examples of symbiosis, both among humans and then in our natural worlds, and seeing those as models. Because I'm in the high desert now. We don't have water. We don't have running water. We just moved here a few months ago, but we're building a water catchment system. And what I've learned about, I think, Colorado in general is that every drop of water is owned. So it's actually even illegal to do water catchment systems.
I know that well.
So say again.
I said, I know that well. I'm in real estate, so I know that well.
Right. You're right. So yeah, I'd love to speak with you more about that. It's phenomenally profound and perverse. And I'm so curious about the implications and also our ways of maneuvering as citizens in that frame. So I'm bringing that up because basically we're in the high desert of the Rockies, and what Zazu Dreams does is position examples, for example, from 9th century Iran and aquifers in particular climates, environments there, that we can then learn to adopt, maybe aspects of them, maybe fully. Or looking at what happened in Michigan, Flint, Michigan, 2015 with the lead poisoning, and looking at that in relation to Turkey and coal power plants and the water contamination. And so it's this constant back and forth reference across time and space. So I talk also about quantum wormholes and quantum entanglements. You haven't gotten to that chapter, okay. But again, the simultaneity, I really want to emphasize the simultaneity. When we're looking at different cultures, different geographies, different climates, different ways of having a sense of intimacy with nature, of our understanding our own electrical beings in relation to interspecies communication, all of that, it's fertile ground for us to learn and to take action and not just go with the familiar. That's what, this viscous expectations in so many ways is about the unfamiliar, our unknown, not someone else's unknown. We learn from others. And that again requires humility and vulnerability.
Fair enough. Well, Cara, Judea, I'm just blown away. I really would love to just sit in a room with you for 6 hours and just talk about all of the facets of life. But I'm so blessed. I'm so lucky to have had you on the show. Sounds very sweaty. Yeah. Well, maybe. I mean,
thank you.
It's been a pleasure. I already look forward to coming on and talking to you again. I'll have to think through everything you've said today. I always just love to ask people what advice they have for young people who are coming up during this time at the end of the show.
Yeah. Trust yourself, trust your intuition, and take risks by making unexpected connections. And in those risks of unexpected connections, we may find allies in unexpected places. And we need each other.
Amen. Well, it's been a pleasure. Like I said, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank
I
you.
look forward to chatting with you after this a little bit as well. And for
Okay.
everybody else, hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you next week as always. Take care. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Changing the Climate. Here at Climate Change Realty, we don't just donate 50% of our net commissions to fight climate change, we also donate a full 50% of our real estate referrals. So if you or anyone else you know is looking to buy or sell a home anywhere in the USA and would like to create thousands of dollars in donations without any cost out of pocket, please visit ccrboulder.com today.